Here we are. We are back once again, live at lunch. Welcome. Thank you. And I am enjoying this once again. And I just have to say, this will be our final episode on prophecy. Um, we've talked about a few things along the way, but today we're just getting into a prophet without honor, a prophet without honor. And as we do this, we really want to get into some pieces about how God is able to utilize, the man of God in numerous ways and numerous places. And you can definitely see that this is going to be one of those pieces that will have some, tidbits in it about serving God and what that presents as far as the status of the servant, even among people who believe in God. So definitely thank you for joining us and checking us out, and truly appreciate your time with us. So let's get this thing started. Pastor Powell won't be with us today, but God bless him. We're going to move on as we look at this for the final lesson on prophecy, and Godspeed to Pastor Powell. And hopefully he can rejoin us in the next week or so. And so, boom. One of the things we see here is Jesus breaks it down. He says, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and among his own relatives and in his own house. That says a lot, says a whole lot. And let me break this down. It really comes down to the prophet being persona non grata, and that's the person without grace. That's really tough when it's around and among the people who are worshiping, God, but also entertaining other things, the world and things of that nature. So here it is. These guys are doing it among people who are worshiping other gods. And boom, that just is terrifying to even think about it. But the prophet not only carried the word of God, but they also did it while living among the people of God, especially their own kinsmen who lived among these folks too. So it really made it to where the prophet was objectified and vilified in a lot of senses, with these lessons that were definitely dealing with uncleanness and defilement. And sometimes the prophet wasn't taken seriously and not respected adequately. And as I say it here, the prophet was definitely rejected because he spoke against the people's rebellion through their idol worship. And so that came into play at times as well. And then you see it here, right? You see it here where those object lessons of the prophet at times definitely got people's attention, but it also created more of a problem with them and the people, right? With the prophets and the people. How they delivered their message didn't help in some cases. Look at what happened when Jeremiah wore the yoke of an ox. I mean, my man, beat the yoke off of him, and it landed Jeremiah in so much division between him and the people and the leaders. But he was doing it for the sake of the ministry. Hosea, he married a whore, a harlot. Look at Hosea 3:1. We'll look at that later on. Isaiah, he walked around naked and barefoot for 3 years, and that's in Isaiah 20. And you'll see this, and you'll say, well, man, what was God doing with these folks? How was God using them? And when you see this, you say, man, this is different. This is definitely different. So let's look at this and look at a couple of examples that we have here. And one of the examples is Elisha. Now, Elisha, let's be real. Elisha is one of my favorite biblical characters, but Elisha was the servant who was under Elijah. Elisha. He was under the prophet of fire, and he's the one that when the prophet was getting ready to be taken up in the chariot, he's the one that asked for a double portion. You know, he's the one that asked for the double portion of what the prophet had before he left. Okay, and so this is what it says in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. From there, Elisha went up to Bethel, and as he was walking along the road, some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. Right? They was heckling him. They was mocking him. They said, "Get out of here, Baldy." They said, "Get out of here, Baldy." He turned around, looked at them, called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. Woo! Okay. And so what we've got here is they called him out of his name. They jeered at him and told him to get out of town. And there were just some kids. There were some youth, from within the community, and they had no respect for the man of God. And what does Elisha do? He curses them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she bears, according to King James Version, came out and tore apart 42 children. If you don't know this, listen, Elisha was definitely not a social butterfly. He was not one known for his social graces. And so the way he handled Naaman, the one that came, to deal with, his leprosy and get healed, was he didn't even answer the door. He talked to the man, didn't even open the door for the man, right? And in Luke 4:27, Jesus said, and there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha, the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. And so even though Elisha was not a, socially accepted or even engaging person, Elisha still demonstrates what Jesus is talking about as far as a prophet without honor in their own home. And so when we look at this, Elisha, right, definitely being mocked shows us some of the conditions that come about when we're dealing with the prophets. Look at this. Isaiah, one of my main guys, Isaiah chapter 20, verses 2 through 4. Here it is. At the same time spake the Lord by Isaiah the son of Amos, saying, Go and loose the sackcloth from off thy loins, and put off thy shoe from thy foot. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot. And the Lord said, Like as my servant Isaiah hath walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and a wonder upon Egypt and upon Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians prisoners and the Ethiopians captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, even with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. I mean, come on. That's the King James Version. The English Standard Version says, My servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years. Listen, 3 years in that condition to serve as an object lesson, right? For these people who were going into impending captivity under the Assyrian king. I mean, the Lord used him, and 365 times 3, that's plenty of time, right? That's plenty of time, over 1,000 days, right? Walking around naked and barefoot for someone to get a picture of what the lesson is. And then you got my man Hosea, one of the most beautiful stories of love in the Bible. If you want to compare this to Song of Solomon, Song of Solomon is about loving someone who is faithful to you. This is one about loving someone who's unfaithful to you. Which one is more like God's love? Come on now. Which one is more like the love of God that you experience as a believer who still is tempted in every way by every type of sin. And so Hosea hits home in a whole nother way. He does it in a different manner because God uses Hosea's marriage as an object lesson and Hosea's parenthood. Hosea's children, remember one of Hosea's children was named Not My People in translation. You know what I mean? And so here it is. Hosea is commissioned by God to get his wife off of the streets, to get him a wife that it says in Hosea 1 and 2, that says promiscuous woman in the NIV. It says she's a harlot in the NSAB. She's a whore in the King James Version. But Hosea is told to marry her according to what it says is divine appointment. You know, God assigns him to do it. According to the easy to read version of the Bible, it says, "Then the Lord said to me again, Gomer has many lovers, but you must continue loving her. Do this because it is an example of the Lord's love for Israel. He continues to love them, but they continue to turn to other gods, and they love to eat those raisin cakes." They love to worship these other gods. They love to serve these other idols. And so God uses Hosea to exemplify this. And it's in Hosea that we get God, Hosea buying back Gomer, right? He buys back Gomer with what is it? 6. He paid 6 ounces of silver and 9 bushels of barley for her in Hosea 3 and 2. I mean, come on. That was like definitely a price in that time, right? But he did that, right? He did that in order to get her back from this world that she lived in that, you know, accepted her as a harlot, but Hosea was accepting her based upon who she was to him in this example, right? It's one thing for her, as the text says, to have many lovers, but it's another thing for her to be embraced with the love of Hosea, the example of God's love for Israel, as, you know, what my man Isaiah would say, Israel is out there playing the harlot, okay? And so that's Hosea. That's, that's Hosea. That's Isaiah. That's Elisha. And then we go back to Elijah. Elijah was on the run, right? Elijah was on the run from the beginning, right? Elijah was on the run when he rode up on Ahab and said, "Look, till you do right, and you and your wife stop tripping about how to run this kingdom, it's not going to rain up in here. This is how it's going to be." And to understand that, look at that. Elijah had to run and go to Zarephath, right? And that's where, one of the resurrections, right? One of the incidents of someone being brought to life when the widow's son passes while Elijah is staying with her. That's one of the incidents while Elijah is on the run, where he lays over the boy 3 times and he's brought back to life. That's still in 1 Kings chapter 17, right? And when we look at that and we look at what Elijah did to end up being on the run, they said he was a wild and hairy man, right? Untaken care of, right? And when he was on the run, you definitely can imagine he wasn't clean shaven and taken care of while he was on the run. And so just take that into account of who Elijah was and how he lived. And let's look at the Lord himself, right? The Lord himself was rejected in Nazareth. Go back to when Jesus was going to his home temple, his home synagogue, as some of y'all would say, his home church. And as custom, they would pass the scroll for the reading. And when it was your turn, you open the scroll where it was last left off. And Jesus reads the passage from Isaiah that says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And he reads that in its fullness. And then he rolls that thing back up, closes it up, and says, "And this day, within your hearing, it has been fulfilled." Like, look, we're not just reading about it, you're looking at it. You know, we're not just talking about it, you're experiencing him. You're with the one that Isaiah is talking about. I'm in your midst. I'm among you. The Emmanuel, right? And people in that vicinity, they say, "Oh, no, don't we know this guy? Don't we know his family? Aren't his sisters and brothers among us? Right? Don't we know his father and mother?" And they rejected him and sought to stone him, you know? And in the midst of that, Jesus says in 4:24, "Then he said, assuredly I say to you, no prophet is accepted in his own country." There's not a lot that we read about Jesus doing in Nazareth. We read a lot about his Galilean ministry, but not Nazareth, you know. And when we think about it, you know, there's a lot to be said about what Jesus didn't do in Nazareth. And let's be real, he healed some and he did some things, you know, healed the sick and made some things happen. And that's perfectly fine, but it wasn't all of what could have been done, right? Based upon how they rejected him, based upon how they dealt with him coming. And that's part of the problem. And when we look at that and we see that here it is where they didn't accept him in Nazareth, right? And he was rejected. They sought to stone him, and he only was able to do but so much there before moving on with his greater mission and ministry through the Galilean ministry and everything else he was able to do in Palestine, and even what he was able to do going through everything leading up to his triumphant entry and dying on the cross. So there's not a lot that Jesus did in Nazareth, okay? And then we see this and we catch on to this a little bit about Jesus's own brothers, man. Jesus's own brothers. It's amazing when we get to this about how Jesus's own brothers were not believers. In fact, let's just take a moment here. It says a lot about those who are close to you and how they view your ministry, right? And how they respond to your ministry. And what we're seeing here with Jesus is how they dealt with his ministry was say, well, you go up there to the feast that's coming up with your own disciples. You go up there with them and let them hear you talk and teach and preach and do your thing that you're calling ministry. But, you know, you go on, you know, away and aside from us. We've got other plans because we're not planning to go with you. This isn't them going as a family. This is them going beyond and outside of Jesus. And so Um, in the text, John reflects back on this in his writing of his gospel and says, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him." We got to remember, this is the man of sorrows. This is Jesus, who comes as the Lamb of God to take away the sins of the world, and his own brothers don't believe in him. Later on, we see James and Jude do believe, and we have some beautiful, uh, magnificent epistles from them that really speak to walking through this journey as a believer. But that's afterwards, that's later in the midst of his earthly ministry. Even his own brothers did not believe in him. And so that's Jesus. And if that's what happens to Jesus, what's going to happen to your ministry? Well, how's that going to work out? How's that going to fit? What should be inspiration to somebody is that Jesus said, "Rejoice and be exceedingly glad," right? "For great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, because they persecuted the prophets before you. Why are you to rejoice and be exceedingly glad? Because of what comes before that. What comes before that is verse 11. And verse 11 simply gives us a whole nother view of what Jesus is talking about. This is coming from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, and this is verse 11, as it is in the Sermon on the Mount. Verse 11 said, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely, for my sake." And that's where the hook for "rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven" comes up. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. That's where that connection comes in. That's where that hook is, because you're being reviled by others, ridiculed by others, beguiled by others. You're being persecuted. You're being taken and taken through the ringer, and you have people saying, quote unquote, all manner of evil against you falsely. And it's not just because you're a bad person, or you're trying to build an empire for yourself, or you're trying to do something to level up and be more than anybody else. It's when it happens for the Lord's sake. It's when you're trying to do something good and people are trying to take you down. It's when you're trying to do good works and people are trying to take you out. And the Lord says, don't try to get revenge. Don't try to get back at them. Somebody needs to hear that today. This isn't about you. This is about me. And there's an example of individuals who have come along before you, who have experienced this. And I want to let you know, you ought to rejoice and be glad when it happens, because great is your reward in heaven. Can you imagine when you really unpack that, in the midst of everything that the Lord laid out, he was still showing us an example through the prophets, right? And he was still showing us an example of how to take it when people are throwing these things at us, and still look beyond what's immediate, beyond what's earthly, and look at what's eternal. Look at what's, of the things to come. The Lord is giving an example to someone who is going through ministry right now. John the Baptist did it, right? John the Baptist said, I gotta decrease so he can increase. John the Baptist knew his mission was to prepare the way, and even in doing that, when John was in jail, John sent his disciples and said, ask him, is he the one, or should we look for another? Because I don't see, as my life is coming to an end, I don't see him doing the things that we expected out of a Messiah and the Christ. And what did Jesus tell him? Go and tell John what you see. The blind see, the lame walk, and the gospel is preached. This is what I came to do, and so take it like that. The Lord is using this time to show us something. What is the Lord showing you? And when you look at it, what is he showing you through the prophets, right? And their experience, right? What is he showing you as you look further at what he was able to do with their lives, and he was able to shed an example with what they were able to do. I'm saying this because as we go forward, someone's in ministry, someone's trying to make this happen, and as you try to make this happen, it seems like everyone's down on you, and don't take it that way. If you're doing it for the Lord's sake, rejoice and be exceedingly glad. Rejoice, right? And be exceedingly glad, because it's not just about what is happening with you. It's also about, why is it happening to you? For whose sake is it happening? And in that, right, what is being made out of it? What's being laid up in heaven for you, and versus what's being, placed as an obstacle here for you. I want somebody to be blessed today. I want somebody to understand that we looked at this with prophecy so people wouldn't be misled and wouldn't have a misunderstanding of it. But we also looked at this with prophecy so that people would be inspired and encouraged to, look at the word and what the word does for us and how the word provides for us. And the word is providing lessons. Yeah, it may be extreme that Isaiah walked around naked and barefoot for 3 years, but look at the lessons that are in that, and what it was teaching people at that time and teaching us now in our time. Look at what happened with Ezekiel and him laying on his side and eating the scroll and all of these things that were happening as object lessons. Look at Hosea and what that, marriage taught us. That marriage taught us more than anything else that you might have seen in God's love, with a visible picture, an object lesson right there of God loving to the end, regardless of what it is. Somebody needs to break away and make peace with that past. And here it is. God still loved a harlot and a nation that acted in harlotry, and still did it in a manner that was kind, merciful, long-suffering, and welcoming to those that were repentant. And so, trust it today. This is a message for somebody who might be in ministry, who might be ready to walk away, give up. The prophet without honor is still happening. But when you look at it, it's not just about here. It's not just about here and now. It's not just about what's happening. It's about how you deal with it and how you get through it. And what are you really leaning on? Are you leaning on God? Are you trusting God? And if you're trusting God, trust him to take care of it entirely and fully. And I just want you to be blessed to truly understand that God is doing this in a manner to where you can see and awaken to some of the things that God has for you beyond what people will do to you. Hey, we'll be back next week with another study. I want you to trust and believe that God is here and He is truly, truly offering you something that is beyond um, beyond a limited blessing, and that blessing is you can truly rejoice, right, and be exceedingly glad, right, because you've got a great reward waiting in heaven because they've persecuted others just like this before you. And if you're doing it for His sake, understand you're going to withstand some problems. God be with you. God bless you. Godspeed. Amen.